Et donc maintenant, on va lancer cette vidéo. Vous allez voir qu'il parle, on n'a pas fait exprès, hein, mais il parle de l'entanglement, et il parle du principe anthropique, du réglage fin, et il parle aussi de la probabilité, et en termes prudents, justement, de la foi ou non par rapport à la science. Donc c'est la dernière pierre de cette journée de construction. On écoute maintenant donc cet enregistrement fait hier de Bill Phillips en espérant qu'on l'aura un jour au Maroc.
First, thank you so much to take your time from Brazil to speak with us. And I will begin directly with the first question. You often say that if science cannot prove the existence of God, it does, on the other hand, allows for some interesting analogies. Above all, the sense of mystery for you. Could you tell us how science can give us this sense of mystery?
Well, let me give as an example one of the things that I think is most mysterious about quantum science. Quantum science is the basis of the science that I'm involved in. And one of the most strange aspects of it is something that's called entanglement. Now, one of the principles that most people would accept as being obvious is that in order to understand what happens someplace in space, that you only need to know about the things that are nearby. We know that influences don't travel faster than the speed of light, so that if we know everything that is nearby some point in space, we should be able to tell what will happen at that point in space for any time that is short compared to the time that it takes light to travel from the surrounding regions. We shouldn't need to know what happens at some very distant place where the influence of anything that happens there would take longer than the time that we want to consider. That's a completely reasonable idea, and it's not true. And we can do experiments that show that it's not true. And in fact, the Nobel Prize that was given for physics 1 year ago, approximately 1 year ago now, was for experiments that showed that that idea is not true. Well, perhaps I haven't given the full extent of what that idea was. The idea is called local realism. And the idea is that, first of all, that properties exist before you measure them. That's what the realism part. And locality is what I explained, that you should only need to know about what happens nearby in order to understand everything about a particular point in space and time. And those seem like very reasonable ideas, and they're not true. And we can do experiments that show that they're not true. And in fact, as I said, the Nobel Prize was given for some of those experiments, which very clearly showed that this very reasonable idea is simply not true. To me, this is one of the most mysterious aspects of quantum mechanics, that something that seems so completely reasonable is simply not true. And I don't believe that anybody really understands how this comes about. Feynman once said, anyone who believes they understand quantum mechanics hasn't thought about it carefully enough. So there is an example of this sense of mystery that exists in science that we can't, in some sense, fully get our minds around, and yet is the case. I hope the background noise isn't too bad. I'm in the office of a colleague, and I can hear some sounds of motorcycles outside. So I hope it's not too disconcerting.
No, but I'm so glad, Bill, that you begin our discussion by speaking about entanglement. You know that my master, Bernard Espagna, have worked with John Bell on the question of Bell inequalities, and you explained this, but I want to add a question about entanglement. We have Anton Zellinger, who received the Nobel Prize last year for work on these topics with Alain Aspect. He just make an intervention by video like you before in this meeting. And for him, he clearly said that it showed that reality, ultimate reality, is not in space, time, matter, and energy, because there's something who go beyond. And I think it's very important, not only for believer, but for any philosophical point of view, to claim that reality does not finish, is more than our world. You agree with this idea, I suppose?
Well, I agree with the idea. I'm not sure how much science has to say about it. But as you emphasized, this idea of mystery is more of an analogy to the kind of mystery that exists in our spiritual lives, in our understanding of religious faith, rather than being an example of that kind of spiritual mystery.
Apart from entanglement, which are the other experiment or field of science who give us interesting analogies?
Well, for example, we can ask what appears to be a completely reasonable question. We might ask, what is the position and velocity of a certain particle, say an electron? It sounds as if it's a completely reasonable question. But quantum mechanics tells us that, in fact, it is not a reasonable question, that it is impossible to know both the position and the velocity of a particle at the same time. This is the famous uncertainty principle of Heisenberg. And what appears to be a perfectly well-posed and reasonable question, in fact, is not. And so that's another example, I think, of something that provides an analogy to something that we may encounter in our spiritual lives. So for example, we might ask, how is it if God is good and God loves us and God is in control of the universe, how is it that there is evil in the world? And even after we discount the possibility that God has given us the freedom to choose between good and evil so that we can create evil in the world, we could still ask about bad things that happen that don't appear to be the result of bad choices by human beings, and ask, why do these things exist? People have asked this question since at least the time of when the book of Job was written. The book of Job was written in a sense to address that problem. And I don't think anybody thinks that the answer given in the book of Job is a particularly satisfying one. And I don't think that any of the people who have addressed this problem since, and many thinkers have addressed this problem since then, I don't think anybody has felt that they have come up with a fully satisfying answer to that question. The fact that in quantum mechanics, I have a question that appears to be a reasonable question for which there is no answer, at least not within the realm of quantum mechanics, gives me a little bit of comfort that there are questions that I might ask in my spiritual life that also do not have answers, at least not answers that I can access.
Yeah, very interesting analogy. But apart from analogy, there are also facts. This morning we hear Professor Luc Barnes from Sydney University speaking about the fine-tuning argument and how the universe is fine-tuned for development of complexity and life. It's another topic of our meeting, and I think it's a topic of interest for you also. So perhaps you can comment about this.
Yes. So, for example, some people have calculated that if the fine structure constant, the dimensionless constant of nature that describes how strong electromagnetic forces are, if the fine structure constant were a little different, maybe 10% different from what it is, then basic chemical processes that allow our life to exist would not be. Those chemical processes wouldn't work, and life, at least as we know it, wouldn't exist. And there are any number of other constants of nature which appear to be, as you say, fine-tuned so as to allow life to exist, or to allow even stars and planets to exist. If the expansion of the universe had been a little bit faster or a little bit slower, then it appears that that stars and galaxies wouldn't have formed, and then obviously we wouldn't exist either. And so people have speculated, why is this so? We don't have any good reason for knowing that the values of the fundamental constants of nature or the initial conditions of the universe should have been what they were. So why do we exist? In fact, philosophers have asked this question for millennia. Why is there something rather than nothing? And science doesn't appear to have any answer to this question. So one possible answer is things are the way they are because God decided that's the way things should be, that God wanted a universe in which there would be people with whom God could have relationships that were meaningful. Now, that's a powerful argument, and some people have been persuaded to change their view from atheism to at least deism because of this argument. The philosopher Antony Flew wrote a book about exactly this. On the other hand, modern science has suggested that our universe may be one of a huge number of universes. The number 10 to the 500 has been suggested. That's a number that's so big, it's incomprehensible, at least to me. And that we happen to be only one of those universes. And the other universes, or most of the other universes, were not so lucky as we were. And there aren't any people in them or any intelligent beings in them. And this was just a matter of luck. So while, again, it is suggestive, and you might even argue that a simpler explanation of why we exist is that God wanted us to exist, that's a simpler explanation than to say that there are 10 to the 500 universes of which we are only one, it doesn't really prove the existence of God.
Yes, but as you just mentioned, it's very interesting to see that the famous Occam razor, that means Occam razor, the most simple explanation could be the best.
Yes.
Now the Occam razor is on the side of the believer, because the non-believer, of course, they can have non-belief, but they have to postulate an infinite number of universe, almost infinite. Interesting, no?
Yes, I certainly believe that Occam's razor is on the side of the existence of God, but let's face it, the question of which example, of which explanation is more simple is a subjective one. And I'm guessing that there are other people who believe that Occam's razor is on the side of the multiverse explanation. So,
okay. But you say, oh, you often say that physicists, at least some of them, are or must be more modest after the discovery of physics of the last century, because physics show us that it cannot grasp the fundamental reality of things. Can you develop this idea?
Well, I guess one of the main reasons why I believe that physicists should be humble is that in the past, it has turned out that when we thought we understood things, in fact, we did not. So, for example, around 1900, there were famous physicists who said, well, we understand pretty much everything. And the only thing that's left in physics is to get the last few decimal points in a few decimal places, I should say, in the measurement of things. And then the most fundamental changes in the way we think about physics happened. Quantum mechanics, special relativity, general relativity completely changed the way we think about the universe. So those people who said that we understood everything could not have been more wrong. Around the year 2000, this same idea was brought up again. In this case, not really mostly by physicists, but mostly by popular writers about science, claiming, well, we know pretty much everything. And now it's very clear that of all of the matter and energy in the universe that we know about, we understand about 5% of that to be the kind of matter that we're familiar with. And the rest of it is either dark matter, and we have no idea what dark matter is, or it's dark energy, and we have even less idea what dark energy is. So I think that in the face of knowing that 95% of the universe is something that we don't know anything about, you have to be humble. So I think that, and I think that physicists have learned their lesson from the events of 1900, not to believe that we really understand most of what there is to understand. There's plenty left that we don't know about.
Okay, you often told me that, of course, there's questions to which science hasn't got any answer. It's easy to say that science does not answer the question of love, for example. But to be more provocative, and following Bernard España I mentioned before, I think science can also be things like quantum physics, uncertainty principle, or Gödel's theorem that we'll discuss tomorrow with Gregory Scheitin, by the way. Science is able to demonstrate from inside some limit. I think it's an interesting point on philosophical point of view, no? That science, it's not only to say, okay, there is love and science will never explain love, but science can show its limitation from inside sometimes.
Well, yes. So as we've already discussed, there are some questions that appear to be reasonable, that in quantum mechanics we know are not in fact reasonable. So these are things that science cannot know. Science would appear to indicate not only can it not know this, but that knowledge does not exist. Now, we don't know that for sure. It might be that that God knows the outcome of an uncertain quantum mechanical experiment and has arranged things in such a way that it will appear to us that that those events are completely random. We just don't know that, and I don't think there's any way we can know that. I believe that there are questions like you said, like understanding love, although some people might believe that they could completely explain love using biochemistry and neuroscience. I don't believe they can, and even if they could, I don't want to think about love that way. And there are questions that are outside of science. Like, I don't think science can address questions like, what is the nature of God? What does God want from us as God's creatures? I don't think that's a scientific question, and science has no business even thinking about questions like that. But there are other questions where it's hard to tell. For example, one of the great mysteries of modern science is, where does human consciousness come from?
Yeah,
we are a collection of chemical reactions and neurophysiology, electrical impulses. How does the fact that our minds are aware of ourselves, of our place in the universe, we're aware of our own mortality, where does that come from? It doesn't appear that you could build a computer that had that kind of consciousness. Now, the human mind is such a complex organism, that is, the human brain is such a complex organism, that it's essentially impossible for modern science to understand the workings of such a complex organism. The idea of emergent phenomena comes to mind, something where the system is so complex that starting from the basic building blocks, you can't compute what the answers are. We know in physics that there are many such physical systems that at least classical computers cannot compute them. So this question of where does consciousness arise from is an open question that it's not clear whether science will be able to answer that question. It may very well be that it is beyond the scope of science to be able to answer such a question. I would say we simply don't know that. So I think there's a variety of questions. It could also be that there are things that are valid scientific questions for which the understanding is beyond human capability.
That's nice.
Think about the fact that there are lots of animals that are reasonably intelligent and can learn all sorts of things. We can teach dogs to do all kinds of things, but we can't teach dogs quantum mechanics. It is simply beyond the capability of the brains of dogs to understand quantum mechanics. It's not beyond the capability of people to understand quantum mechanics, or at least to be able to do lots of quantum mechanical calculations. But it could be that there's something else, some grander theory of the universe that is beyond the capability of human beings. Our brains are not infinitely capable, so it could be that there are things we will simply not understand, and that means that at least science that we as human beings create will not be able to understand. But we just don't know.
Very interesting. So now, of course, you are a very deep scientific person and a deep religious person at the same time. Have you some point of tension in your life between the two? And more generally, not only for you, what are the sort of point of tension between science and religion you can see or imagine?
Well, as I mentioned, the problem of evil in the world is a central question. What I think perhaps the most difficult question of Christianity, of the monotheistic religions, maybe of any religion, that trying to understand this idea that if the God that we believe is at the center of our lives and the center of the universe is good and kind, why are there bad things that happen in spite of that have nothing to do with human intervention? Why are there earthquakes and tornadoes, and why is there disease that affects very young children? These are very difficult questions, and the fact that there is no good answer to that, in spite of all the thinking that people have done about it, sometimes makes me wonder, am I right? Is there really a God, or is everything just random? I do believe in God, but there's an old saying, Lord, I believe, please help my unbelief.
I see. So, and now you say that science and religion, of course, are two different domains, but for you, we cannot have a complete separation between the two. So why it's impossible to have complete separation of science and religion for you?
Yeah, so some people have claimed that there should be a complete separation, the idea of
No matter.
non-overlapping magisteria, as some people have claimed, and that this solves the problem because they just deal with completely different aspects of life. And I don't see that separation being complete. I think that it's, for most things, it's separate. But let's take something like the question of whether we should modify the human genome in such a way that the modifications we make are inheritable by future generations. We now have the capability of doing that. And the question arises, should we? Now, in order to answer that question, I think we want to have, I don't know what the answer to that question is, first of all, I should say, but I think we should have the insights of both science and religion to apply to a question like that. in order to find good answers. I think that if all we did was pay attention to the scientific aspects, then we might make bad decisions. If all we did was pay attention to the religious aspects, saying that, well, human beings as well as all of nature is the creation of God, and God wants things to be this way, so we shouldn't tamper with it, I think that would be a short-sighted way of doing things as well. That we should include the insights that arise from both science and religion in order to address difficult questions that have a strong scientific content. Climate change is another. I think that there are some people who would say, let's not worry about climate change because God is in control and God won't let anything really bad happen to the world. And other people will say, again, speaking from the spiritual point of view, that God has appointed us to be the stewards of the earth, and we have responsibilities to God to take care of our earth. Well, so those are might be among the religious things you should apply to this question. On the scientific side, we have to know what is it that we do as human beings that can affect the climate. So I think that there are questions where you need both perspectives.
Thank you. And to finish, we discuss about entanglement, we discuss about fine-tuning, but there was the famous question from Schrödinger who say, what are the scientific discovery the most interesting for believer? So I just want to know if you have another point you can develop with interesting for believer generally in science before we conclude.
Well, I think that one of the things that has taken that has gained a lot of attention in modern times, quite recently, is artificial intelligence and the ability to create machines that reproduce many of the features of human thought. I think that most people would claim that the famous Turing test for whether you have created an artificial intelligence that is like a human being has been passed by the most recent large language models. The Turing test was, could you have a conversation with this machine for some period of time and not realize that it's a machine instead of a person? I think we now have machine programs that could pass that test. I think that it doesn't, nevertheless, pass the test of being like a human being. I think there are such obvious things that these large language model artificial intelligence programs cannot do that they make it clear that they are not like a human intelligence. But they're so much closer than they used to be that it makes us think again about what happens if it is possible, and I don't know whether it is possible, to create an artificial intelligence that reproduces human thought and human judgment and human consciousness. If it does become possible, then we have to ask ourselves really important questions like, would such a machine be a person of sacred worth? Would such a person have moral responsibilities? That is, would such a machine have moral responsibilities? Would human beings have moral responsibilities to such a person? I think that would be a development that would create lots of difficult and interesting questions for people of religious faith.
So, Bill, thank you so much for your time to speak to us from Brazil to Morocco, and we hope to receive you in Morocco one day, another year, in this very interesting place. I hope you will discover the UM6P University. So again, thank you very much for this fascinating discussion on many different important topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that I can appear sometime in person.